Dead man returned at midnight to find his widow married. The corrupt sheriff, Thomas Hartwell, clawed his way out his own grave with bloody fingernails and a broken heart, only to discover his wife had married the man who buried him alive. What he did next would either destroy them all or prove that love is stronger than death itself. The desert wind carried whispers of the dead, but Thomas Hartwell had learned not to listen. He stood in the darkness beyond his own front porch, dust settling in the creases of his weathered face like the memory of his burial. 6 months. 6 months since Perdition Creek had mourned him, since they'd sung hymns over an empty coffin, since Sarah had thrown dirt on a grave that held nothing but lies. The cabin glowed warm against the endless night, candlelight spilling through windows he'd once gazed through with hope. But hope was a luxury for the living, and Thomas had died the day Sheriff Coleman Briggs sealed him beneath tons of rock and greed. What crawled out of that mine was something harder, something carved from rage and the bitter taste of betrayed earth. Through the dusty glass, he watched his wife move like poetry in motion. Sarah's dark hair caught the candlelight as she spun, her calico dress, the blue one he bought her for their wedding anniversary, flowing around her like water. She was laughing. The sound drifted across the porch where Thomas had once whittled toys for children they'd planned to have, where he'd held her during thunderstorms, where he'd kissed her goodbye on the morning Briggs came with his lies about rustled cattle and mining claims. She was dancing, in their home, in his grandmother's arms. No, not his grandmother's arms. The arms belonged to Coleman Briggs, thick and possessive around Sarah's waist. The sheriff's badge caught the light like a star pinned to his chest, a star built on graves and stolen dreams. Thomas's fingers curled into fists, dirt still caked beneath his nails from the digging. Always the digging. First to escape his own death, then to uncover the truth about the man who'd put him there. The ring on Sarah's finger flashed as she lifted her hand to Briggs's face. Thomas's grandmother's ring, the one with the tiny chip in the sapphire, the one that had blessed 3 generations of Hartwell marriages. It caught the candlelight like a signal fire, broadcasting her betrayal across the desert silence. He took a step closer to the window, his boots silent on the worn boards. Inside, Briggs was speaking, his mouth moving against Sarah's ear. Whatever he whispered made her blush, made her turn her face into his shoulder like she used to do with Thomas when the nights grew cold and the world felt too big for just 2 hearts to fill. Thomas pressed his palm against the glass, and for a moment, he swore Sarah looked toward the window. Her laughter caught, stumbled, and she pulled back from Briggs with a frown creasing her brow. She stared directly at the spot where Thomas stood, her green eyes wide in the candlelight, and he held his breath like a man still buried, still fighting for air. "What is it, darling?" Briggs's voice carried through the thin walls, honey smooth and poisoned at the edges. "Nothing," Sarah whispered, but she didn't look away from the window. "I thought nothing." She knew, somewhere in the part of her heart that had once beat against his chest during long winter nights, she knew he was there. The connection that death couldn't sever, that betrayal couldn't fully break, pulled tight between them like a rope thrown across an impossible canyon. Briggs followed her gaze, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip. The motion was instinctive, practiced, the reflex of a man who'd built his kingdom on other men's bones. Thomas smiled in the darkness, expression cold as desert stone. Let him look. Let him wonder what shadows moved beyond his stolen light. "You're jumpy tonight," Briggs said, turning Sarah back toward him. "It's our wedding night, Mrs. Briggs. Nothing but good things ahead of us now." "Mrs. Briggs." The name fell between them like a gravestone, heavy and final. Thomas watched his wife, his widow, nod and force her smile back into place. She was trying so hard to be happy, trying to convince herself that this was what safety looked like. A badge, a gun, a man who controlled the law in a town where law was just another word for power. But Thomas knew what safety really looked like. It looked like calloused hands that never raised in anger, like a man who'd rather take a beating than give one, like someone who'd crawl through hell itself to get back to the woman he loved. It looked like everything Coleman Briggs would never be. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending dust devils dancing across the porch. Sarah shivered despite the warmth of the cabin, despite Briggs's arms around her, and Thomas felt the echo of that shiver in his own bones. She was afraid, not of the wind, not of the darkness pressing against the glass, but of something deeper, something that whispered in the space between heartbeats that the dead didn't always stay buried. Thomas stepped back from the window, melting into shadows that seemed to welcome him like an old friend. He'd seen enough for one night. Enough to know that the woman he'd died trying to protect was alive, was fed, was warm. Enough to know that the man who'd killed him was sleeping in his bed, wearing his life like a stolen coat. But mostly, he'd seen enough to know that Sarah remembered. In the way she'd looked toward the window, in the catch of her breath, in the tremor of her hand as she'd touched the ring that still belonged to ghosts. The desert stretched endless around the cabin, full of secrets and shallow graves and men who'd learned that some kinds of justice couldn't be bought with a badge. Thomas walked into that darkness, his footsteps silent as prayer, carrying with him the image of his wife's frightened eyes and the sound of another man's laughter in his home. Tomorrow, he would begin to reclaim what death had stolen. Tonight, he would let the living sleep, unaware that the dead were learning to walk again. Behind him, the candlelight flickered once, as if touched by an unseen hand, and Sarah Briggs looked toward the window one more time before her new husband led her toward a bed that would never truly be theirs. They buried Thomas Hartwell alive, but what crawled out of that mine wasn't the same man who went in, and now he knows exactly who put him there. The abandoned Hartwell mine clung to the mountainside like a wound that refused to heal. Thomas pressed his back against the cold stone, feeling the weight of 1,000 tons of rock above him. Rock that should have been his tomb, would have been if not for the pocket of air that had kept him breathing while the world above mourned his death. He struck a match, the flame dancing across walls still scarred by his fingernails, still stained with his blood. This was where Coleman Briggs had intended to erase him from the world. Not with a bullet, clean and quick, but with darkness and suffocation and the slow terror of knowing no one would ever find him. The memory came back in pieces, sharp as broken glass. 3 weeks before his supposed death, Briggs had arrived at the Hartwell ranch with papers and accusations. Cattle rustling, he'd said, waving wanted posters with Thomas's face sketched in charcoal and lies. Evidence, he'd claimed, pointing to hoofprints and brands that had been altered in the dead of night by men who worked for badges instead of justice. "You're coming with me, Hartwell," Briggs had said, his hand resting on his gun like a promise. "Judge wants to see you in Tucson. Should clear this whole mess up." Sarah had begged Thomas not to go, her fingers clutching at his shirt like she could hold him to the earth through will alone. But Thomas was a man who believed in law, believed in truth, believed that innocent men had nothing to fear from honest badges. He'd kissed her forehead and promised to be back before the new moon, back to help her plant the winter vegetables, back to hold her through the cold nights when the desert wind howled like ghosts. The match burned down to his fingers, and Thomas lit another. In the flickering light, he could see the tools he'd gathered over the past months. A pickaxe with a broken handle, a shovel bent from digging his way out, and a leather satchel filled with papers that would hang Coleman Briggs higher than a Sunday sermon. The accident had been carefully planned. Instead of heading toward Tucson, Briggs had led him to the mine, claiming they needed to investigate reports of claim jumpers. Thomas had walked into the tunnel like a lamb to slaughter, trusting in a system that had already sold his life to the highest bidder. The cave-in hadn't been natural. Thomas had found the blast holes afterward, perfectly placed to bring down just enough rock to seal a man inside, without collapsing the entire mine. Briggs had lit the fuses and ridden away, leaving Thomas to die in darkness while above ground. A different story took shape. Mining accident, they told Sarah. Tragic loss, they'd said. Happens all the time in these mountains, they'd whispered, placing sympathetic hands on her shoulders while her husband clawed at stone and prayed for air that barely came. But Thomas Hartwell was a hard man to kill. Harder still when he had something to live for. He'd found the air pocket by following the sound of water dripping, had used his belt buckle to chip away at loose stone, had eaten cave moss and licked moisture from walls while above ground. The town planned his funeral. It had taken him 18 hours to dig his way out. 18 hours of scraping flesh from his fingers, of breathing dust and determination, of whispering Sarah's name into the darkness like a prayer that could move mountains. When he'd finally emerged, bloody and broken, the moon was full and his funeral was 3 days past. He'd hidden in the desert since then, watching and waiting and learning. Learning that Briggs had moved fast after the accident, courting Sarah with promises of protection and security. Learning that his cattle had been sold to pay debts that Thomas had never owed. Learning that his mining claims had been transferred to the sheriff's office for safekeeping until Sarah could manage them properly. Thomas pulled out a small tin from his satchel and opened it carefully. Inside lay pressed wildflowers, desert paintbrush, and ghost flowers that he'd been leaving for Sarah. At first, it had been just to let her know she wasn't alone, that something beyond the grave still watched over her. But as the weeks passed, and he saw her growing belly beneath her dresses, the flowers had become something else. A question, a hope, a terrible, wonderful possibility. The child she carried could be his. The timing was right, barely. If it was his son or daughter growing beneath her heart, then Thomas Hartwell had something worth living for beyond revenge. Something worth building a future on instead of just settling old debts. He'd seen her touch her stomach when she thought no one was looking, seen her pause at windows as if listening for voices only she could hear. Yesterday, he'd watched her find the latest flower he'd left on her windowsill, watched her hold it to her face and breathe deep like she was trying to smell the ghost of better days. She knew, maybe not with her mind, but with the part of her heart that had once beat in rhythm with his. She knew he was alive, knew he was near, and the knowledge was tearing her apart between grief and hope. Thomas closed the tin and tucked it away. Outside the mine, night was giving way to the gray promise of dawn. Soon, Briggs would wake beside Sarah in their marriage bed, would kiss her good morning with lips that had ordered Thomas's death, would place his hands on her growing belly and claim ownership of a child that might carry Hartwell blood. The thought made Thomas's jaw tighten until it ached. He'd been patient long enough. 6 months of hiding, of watching, of letting the dead stay buried while the living built their lies on his grave. But patience was a luxury he could no longer afford, not with Sarah caught between truth and deception, not with his child growing in her womb. He gathered his tools and papers, shouldering the weight of evidence that could destroy Briggs. Bank records showing payments to men who'd sworn false testimony. Letters arranging the cattle sales before Thomas was even accused. A signed confession from one of Briggs's men, bought with gold and guilt after too many nights of whiskey, had loosened his tongue. But evidence was just paper and ink. Justice was something that had to be taken with bare hands and iron will, carved out of the desert like water from stone. Thomas stepped out of the mine as the sun painted the mountains gold. Below him, Perdition Creek was waking up to another day of Sheriff Coleman Briggs's law. Smoke rose from chimneys, dogs barked in yards, and somewhere in that maze of wood and lies, Sarah was making breakfast for the man who'd widowed her. He started down the mountain, his shadow long behind him like the ghost he'd been for 6 months. Today, he would begin to reclaim his name. Tomorrow, he would face his wife and ask her the question that had kept him alive in the darkness. But first, he had a town to haunt and a corrupt sheriff to remind that some debts followed a man beyond the grave. The wind picked up as Thomas reached the desert floor, carrying dust and the promise of a reckoning that had been too long in coming. Sarah Briggs walked to the creek every evening at sunset. She just never expected her dead husband to be waiting there in the shadows. The creek ran silver in the dying light, whispering secrets to the cottonwood trees that had watched over Perdition Creek since before the town had a name. Sarah walked the familiar path, her hand resting on the curve of her belly, her wedding ring catching the last rays of sun like a signal fire between earth and heaven. She came here every evening now, drawn by something she couldn't name. Coleman said it was dangerous for a woman in her condition to wander alone. But Sarah had been walking this path since she was 16, since before Thomas Hartwell had carved their initials in the old oak, since before love had taught her that some promises were worth keeping even when the grave tried to claim them. The baby moved beneath her palm, a flutter like butterfly wings, or maybe like the ghost of hope she'd been trying to bury for months. 5 months along now, though she'd told Coleman it was 4. Let him believe the child was his if it brought peace to their house. Let him sleep sound in the bed that still smelled like another man's dreams. Sarah, the voice came from the shadows beneath the cottonwoods, soft as prayer and familiar as her own heartbeat. She stopped walking, stopped breathing, stopped believing in the cruel tricks that grief could play on a widow's mind. Don't turn around, the voice said. Not yet. I need you to hear me first. Before you look and decide, I'm just another desert ghost. But Sarah was already turning, already seeing the impossible made flesh and bone, and standing there like salvation, carved from starlight and sorrow. Thomas stepped out of the shadows, 6 months of death and desert sun carved into the lines of his face, his clothes worn and patched, but his eyes, God, his eyes were still the same brown as creek water in summer, still holding all the love she tried to bury with his empty coffin. Thomas. His name fell from her lips like a prayer she'd forgotten how to say. Thomas, you're dead. I know. He took a step closer, his hands raised like a man approaching a spooked horse. Been dead for 6 months now. Buried and mourned and forgotten by everyone but you. She was shaking, her whole body trembling like cottonwood leaves in a storm. This isn't real. You're not real. I buried you, Thomas. I threw dirt on your coffin and listened to Preacher Morrison say words over your grave, and you married Coleman Briggs 3 weeks ago in the church where we spoke our vows. Thomas's voice was gentle, but it cut deep as any blade. Wore your grandmother's dress, the white one with the pearl buttons. He gave you my grandmother's ring because it was all I had left to give. Sarah's hand flew to the ring, twisting it on her finger like it might burn her skin. You're dead. I mourned you. I cried until I had no tears left, and then I cried some more because you were carrying my child. The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible canyon. Sarah's hand stilled on her belly, and in the silence that followed, the creek kept singing, and the cottonwoods kept whispering, and the baby kept moving beneath her palm like it knew its father's voice. How long have you been watching? She whispered. Long enough to know you light a candle for me every night. Long enough to see you find the flowers I've been leaving. Long enough to know that Coleman Briggs killed me to get to you. She was crying now, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. He said you were rustling cattle. Said you were mixed up with bad men, and you believed him? I believed he was trying to help. I believed you were coming home. Sarah's voice broke like her heart had broken every night for 6 months. I waited, and then they came, said there'd been an accident, said the mine had collapsed, and your body was... God, Thomas, they said pieces of you were scattered across half the mountain. Thomas moved closer, close enough to reach out and touch her face if he dared, close enough to see the silver threads grief had woven through her dark hair. I crawled out of that mine 18 hours after Briggs buried me alive. 18 hours of digging through rock and breathing dust, and saying her name like it could move mountains. 18 hours. She stared at him like she was seeing a miracle, like she was watching Lazarus walk out of his tomb, trailing grave clothes and resurrection. You were alive for 18 hours while you mourned me, while the town planned my funeral, while Briggs started courting the grieving widow with promises of protection and security. Sarah's face crumpled, and Thomas couldn't stop himself from reaching out, from cupping her face in his hands like she was something precious and breakable. She leaned into his touch like a flower turning toward the sun, like she'd been dying of thirst, and he was the first clean water she'd tasted in months. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Thomas, I'm so sorry. I thought you were dead, and Coleman. He said the baby needed a father, and I needed protection, and Thomas brushed her tears away with his thumbs, marveling at the softness of her skin, at the warmth that meant she was alive and real and here in his arms again. You did what you had to do. You survived. You kept our child safe. Our child. She covered his hands with hers, pressing them against her face like she could hold him there forever. I wasn't sure, wasn't certain, but the timing I know. I've been counting the days, too. They stood there as the sun painted the sky red and gold, holding each other like they could stop time through will alone, like they could undo 6 months of grief and betrayal with nothing but love and the stubborn refusal to let death have the final word. What happens now? Sarah asked. Coleman, when he finds out you're alive, he'll try to kill you again. Really kill you this time. Let him try. Thomas's voice carried the weight of 6 months in the desert. 6 months of learning that some men were harder to bury than others. About evidence, Sarah? Papers that prove what he did. Witnesses willing to talk. Enough to hang him twice over. Evidence won't stop a bullet. Maybe not. But love might. Thomas moved his hands to her belly, feeling the curve where their child grew beneath her heart. This baby, our baby, it's worth fighting for. Worth dying for, if it comes to that. Sarah covered his hands with hers, and for a moment, they stood connected by love and hope and the promise of new life growing between them. The baby kicked, strong and sure, like it knew its father was finally home. Thomas, Sarah whispered, but the rest of her words were lost in the thunder of hoofbeats and the harsh shouts of men who'd learned to hunt ghosts in the desert darkness. Sarah, where are you? Coleman Briggs's voice echoed across the creek, sharp with authority and edged with something that might have been fear. Behind him rode 4 of his men, badges glinting like stars in the fading light, rifles ready for whatever shadows the desert might birth. Thomas stepped back, his hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip, not to draw, but to remember it was there. He followed you. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I know. Thomas looked at her one more time, memorizing the curve of her face, the way the dying light caught in her hair, the swell of her belly where their future was growing. Whatever happens now, remember that I love you, that I never stopped loving you, even when the grave tried to claim me. Thomas, but he was already moving, stepping back into the shadows beneath the cottonwoods as Briggs and his men thundered into the clearing. Sarah stood alone by the creek, her hand on her belly and tears on her face, looking like a woman who'd just seen the dead walk out of their graves carrying love letters and promises of tomorrow. There you are. Briggs dismounted, his eyes scanning the shadows like a man who'd learned to be afraid of the dark. I told you not to wander off alone. Especially not here. Why especially not here, Coleman? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun that hadn't been fired yet. Briggs looked at his wife, Thomas's wife, and for the first time since he'd pinned on his badge, Sheriff Coleman Briggs looked like a man who'd finally met the ghost he'd been running from. Because, he said, his hand resting on his gun, sometimes the dead don't stay buried. In the shadows, Thomas smiled like a man who'd just remembered what it felt like to be alive. Thomas Hartwell faced his killer at dawn, but the choice between revenge and redemption would cost him everything he thought he wanted. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats, long enough for Sarah to step between the living and the dead, long enough for Coleman Briggs to taste fear like copper pennies on his tongue, long enough for Thomas Hartwell to choose the man he wanted to be when the sun rose on whatever remained of his life. Easy, boys. Thomas stepped out of the shadows, his hands visible and empty, though the weight of his gun pressed against his hip like a promise unfulfilled. No need for bloodshed. Not with a woman and child present. Briggs's men raised their rifles, but their leader held up a hand, his eyes never leaving the ghost who'd crawled out of the mountain to reclaim his life. Thomas Hartwell, should have known you were too stubborn to stay dead. Takes more than a corrupt badge and a few tons of rock to bury a man with something to live for. Thomas kept his voice level, conversational, like they were discussing cattle prices instead of murder. Though I appreciate the effort you put into it, Coleman. Very thorough. Almost worked. Should have put a bullet in your brain instead of trusting the mountain to finish the job. Briggs's hand twitched toward his gun. Won't make that mistake twice. Maybe not. But you made plenty of others. Thomas reached slowly into his vest, ignoring the rifles that tracked his movement, and pulled out a leather folder thick with papers. Bank records showing payments to false witnesses. Bills of sale for my cattle dated before you even accused me of rustling. A signed confession from Jake Morrison. Remember Jake? One of your boys who got drunk enough to grow a conscience. The papers scattered in the evening breeze, floating like autumn leaves around Sarah's feet. Evidence enough to hang a sheriff, to tear down the kingdom Briggs had built on other men's graves. But paper was just paper, and justice was something that had to be carved from harder stuff. Doesn't matter, Briggs said, though his voice carried less certainty now. Dead men can't testify. Neither can their widows. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sarah's hand moved to her belly, protective and fierce, and Thomas felt something shift inside him. Not anger, but something cleaner, something that burned like purifying fire. You're right, Thomas said, and let his gun fall to the ground with a soft thud that echoed like thunder across the clearing. Dead men can't testify. But I'm not planning to be dead much longer. Thomas, no. Sarah's voice broke like her heart was breaking all over again. But Thomas was already walking forward, past the scattered evidence, past the loaded rifles, past 6 months of planning revenge that had turned to ash in his mouth the moment he'd touched his unborn child. He stopped an arm's length from Briggs, close enough to see the sweat beading on the sheriff's forehead, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath and the fear in his sweat. I'm offering you a trade, Coleman. My life for theirs. Thomas, don't, Sarah started forward, but one of Briggs's men blocked her path. Let her go, Thomas continued, his eyes never leaving Briggs's face. Let her take the baby and leave town. Give her enough money to start over somewhere safe, somewhere your corruption can't follow. Do that, and I'll walk away. Disappear back into the desert. Become the ghost you meant to make 6 months ago. Briggs laughed, but the sound was hollow, empty of real mirth. Just like that, you'd give up everything for her. Everything I've left is her. Thomas's voice carried the weight of absolute truth. Take my life if you want it, Coleman. But let love live. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through cottonwood leaves and the distant murmur of creek water flowing toward the sea. Sarah was crying again, her tears falling like rain on the scattered papers that contained the evidence of her husband's murder. Boss, one of Briggs's men said quietly, this ain't right. What we done, what we been doing, it ain't right. Shut up, Martinez. No, sir. I won't. The man lowered his rifle, and Thomas saw something he hadn't expected, shame written across a face that had forgotten what honor looked like. I got kids too, boss. Got a wife who looks at me like I'm something worth loving. I ain't taking that from another man. Martinez, he's right, Sheriff. Another man stepped forward, his badge catching the dying light like a star falling to earth. We signed on to keep the peace, not to murder good men for their wives and cattle. You're all forgetting who pays your wages, and you're forgetting who you work for. Martinez pulled his badge from his shirt and let it fall to the ground beside Thomas's gun. We work for the people of this town, not for you. One by one, the other men followed suit, their badges falling like metal tears around the clearing. Briggs stood alone now, his authority scattered like the evidence at his feet, his kingdom crumbling faster than the lies that had built it. This isn't over, Briggs snarled, his gun finally clearing leather. None of you leave here alive. The shot cracked across the clearing like Judgment Day, but it wasn't Briggs who fired. Martinez's bullet took the corrupt sheriff in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying into the creek with a splash that sounded like baptism. Briggs fell to his knees in the mud, clutching his bleeding shoulder and staring up at the men who'd finally remembered what their badges were supposed to mean. You can't. I'm the law in this town. Not anymore. Martinez picked up his badge and pinned it back to his shirt. Thomas Hartwell, by the authority vested in me by the people of Perdition Creek, I'm placing Coleman Briggs under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and corruption. You got anything to add to that? Thomas looked down at the man who'd tried to bury him, who'd stolen his life and his wife and his future, and felt something unexpected bloom in his chest. Not satisfaction, not revenge, but something lighter, forgiveness, maybe, or just the simple relief of putting down a burden he'd carried too long. Just that justice has a way of finding men, even in the desert. The sun was setting now, painting the sky red and gold, and promising tomorrow would come whether they were ready or not. Thomas walked to Sarah, who was still standing in the scattered papers like a woman caught between two lives, two choices, two men who'd loved her in their own broken ways. "It's over," he said, reaching for her hands. "Is it?" Sarah looked past him to where Martinez was binding Briggs's wounds. "What happens now? What happens to us?" Thomas followed her gaze to the fallen sheriff, then back to the woman who'd married another man to protect their child. "Now we learn how to live again, how to build something new from what's left of what we were. And if I can't? If too much has changed?" Thomas placed his hands on her belly, feeling their child move beneath his palms like a promise of tomorrow. "Then we'll learn together, one day at a time, one sunrise at a time, until we remember what it feels like to be alive instead of just surviving." Sarah covered his hands with hers, and for the first time in 6 months, she smiled like she meant it. Around them, the desert was settling into night, but somewhere to the east, dawn was already gathering strength for another day. "Take him to the jail," Martinez told his men, "and send word to the territorial marshal. Time to clean house in Perdition Creek." As they lifted Briggs from the mud, the fallen sheriff looked one last time at Thomas and Sarah, at the love that had survived death and betrayal and 6 months of desert wandering. "This won't bring back what you lost," he said. "No," Thomas agreed, helping Sarah gather the scattered evidence. "But it might help us build what we found." The creek kept singing its ancient song as they walked home together, their shadows long behind them like the ghosts they'd finally learned to leave behind. Above them, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, bright and steady as the love that had called a dead man back to life and taught a town to remember what justice looked like. In the distance, church bells were ringing, not for a funeral this time, but for the simple miracle of another day ending and another beginning, for the endless possibility that tomorrow might be better than yesterday, for the stubborn hope that love could triumph over death if it was willing to pay the price. And in a small cabin at the edge of Perdition Creek, Sarah Hartwell lit a candle in the window, not for the dead this time, but for the living, for the child growing beneath her heart, and for the man who'd crawled out of his own grave to give them both a second chance at forever.